Okay, so in the other chapter, we talked a lot about autism and ADHD, as well as some of the anxiety disorders. Now, I don't want you to become overwhelmed when you hear about all these problems. Each of these conditions has treatments and therapies and proven methods of alleviating the symptoms and taking people to a better place of functioning, a more optimal, a more balanced, a more healthy place to function. For example, if you have anxiety and you can't sleep and you can't focus and you're constantly negative towards yourself, you don't have to just power through that. Your brain and body and person, it has the ability to heal and to integrate, but it's going to need help to do that. And so something I'd like to remind you is that you would never put down someone with asthma for using their inhaler. You would never be like, hey, that person just needs to learn how to breathe better. That would be ridiculous, right? That'd be totally cruel and ridiculous. So why do people do that with mental health stuff? The mind and the body are connected. So goes the mind, so goes the body. We are one whole person with many parts, of course. But if our mind is not functioning very well, and it's telling our body that we're anxious and we're worked up and things aren't going to be good, oh no, panic. If our mind is doing that, then our mind needs some healing. It needs some treatment. Now, whether that's medicine, like actual medicine, or it's a therapy or a talking therapy or an intervention that has been safe and proven to deal with that, that's a good thing. We need to address that. So I just want to remind you that if you have anxiety or if you have some of the concerns that we've been talking about, you don't have to just power through it. You don't have to just be silent and just keep going. And you don't have to compare yourself with other people. Gosh, it's so easy for them. Why is it so hard for me? Especially anxiety. Anxiety is quite common in college students. And so if this is you, then this is the time to kind of recognize it and sort of say, you know what? I've got this thought process. I've got this physical process that's not so adaptive. In fact, it's pretty maladaptive. And if I'm being honest with myself, my anxiety is personally distressing. It actually distresses me. And I need to talk to someone else outside of my family system or outside of my friend system about it so I can get some healthy perspective on it. So if that's you, I strongly, strongly encourage you to reach out to the counseling center and get the help that is there. It's okay. You're going to be okay. We move to a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I've told you guys before, I've been pretty vulnerable about it, that I suffered from depression very significantly in college. And it was really difficult and really dark. I do very much know what it's like to be in your 20s and have this particular condition, which we're going to be talking about, major depression. That if some of this is you, then it's time to take the brave and smart and logical choice of getting more information, getting an outside perspective, and taking care of yourself the way that you would take care of others, right? So let's talk about mood-related disorders. Mood disorders are characterized by severe disturbances in mood and emotion, most often depression, but sometimes also mania and elation. Now, all of us experience fluctuations in our moods and emotional states, and often these fluctuations are caused by events in our life. A best friend gets married, or we get a bad evaluation at work, or a romantic relationship ends. At times we might feel fantastic or miserable, even for no clear reason. That is indeed part of the complicated nature of being human. You might see a movie that strikes a chord with you or hear a song that really does something kind of deep. You might encounter a philosophical or spiritual or existential idea and really ponder for a while the meaning of things. That's normal. But people with a mood disorder also experience mood fluctuations, but those fluctuations are extreme and maladaptive and personally distressing. And ultimately, those mood fluctuations impair their ability to function. Now, depression is a vague term that in everyday life sort of refers to intense and persistent sadness. But actually, depression is a varied mood state, and it consists of a broad spectrum of symptoms that range in severity. Depressed people can, yes, feel sad, discouraged, and hopeless. But these individuals can also lose interest in activities that they once enjoyed, experience a decrease in drives such as hunger or being close to people, and frequently have doubts about their own personal worth. Depressive disorders vary by degree, but we're going to talk about major depressive disorder and also bipolar disorder. Now, bipolar disorder is a group of disorders in which mania is the defining feature. Mania is a state of extreme elation, agitation, arousal, just being up. When people experience mania, they might become extremely talkative, behave recklessly, or attempt to take on so many tasks all at the same time. And the most common of those disorders that have mania as a feature is bipolar disorder. So we're first going to talk about major depressive disorder, and then later we're going to talk about bipolar disorder. According to the DSM, the defining symptoms of major depressive disorder include, and I'm quoting here, depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. That includes things like feeling sad, empty, hopeless, and being close to tears. It also includes loss of interest and loss of pleasure in usual activities. In addition to feeling overwhelmingly sad most of the day, people with depression will no longer show interest or enjoyment in the activities that used to be gratifying. Family and friends may notice that the person has abandoned previous hobbies or relationships and places of joy. To receive a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, a person must experience a total of 5 symptoms for at least a 2-week period, and these symptoms must cause significant distress or impair normal functioning, and they must not be caused by other reasons, like medical reasons or substance abuse reasons. So some of these symptoms include significant weight loss or weight gain, difficulty falling asleep or sleeping too much, being agitated and jittery or slow and almost catatonic and not moving very much, fatigue or loss of energy, significant feelings of worthlessness or guilt, difficulty concentrating, indecisiveness, or suicidal ideation. And that includes thinking about death, planning suicide, having death fantasies, or making an actual suicide attempt. Now, major depressive disorder is considered episodic. Its symptoms are typically present at their full magnitude for a certain period of time and then gradually kind of go away. Approximately 50 to 60% of people that experience one episode of major depression will have a second episode at some point in their future. Those people that have had 2 episodes have a 70% chance of having a third episode. And those people that have suffered with 3 episodes have at least a 90% chance of having a 4th episode. Although the episodes can last for months, a majority of people diagnosed with this condition, around 70%, recover within a year. However, a substantial number of people don't recover. Around 12% show very serious signs of impairment after even 5 years. And untreated depression could lead to suicide or suicide attempts. So the lethality of the disorder or the seriousness of the disorder is very important to talk about. Now, there are many very effective treatments for depression. So something that I'd really like to get you guys thinking about, especially as being part of the world and you've got friends around you and you've got people. So it's important, now that you've taken a psych class, to understand that there are treatments, there are places that can make this better. It can get better. Your brain and body want to grow and flourish and be safe. Your brain wants to make good, healthy connections. So there is hope. Now, there are different subtypes of depression. You've probably heard of seasonal affective disorder or the seasonal pattern. You've probably even heard of postpartum depression, or women that experience a major depressive episode during pregnancy or in the 4 weeks after delivery of their child. There's also a less severe subtype of depressive disorder. So you have major depressive disorder is the most severe depressive category. And there's also persistent depressive disorder. People with persistent depressive disorder experience depressed moods most of the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 years, as well as at least 2 of the other symptoms of major depressive disorder. People with persistent depressive disorder are chronically sad and melancholy, but they don't meet all of the criteria for major depression. So what are some causes of depression? Mood disorders have been shown to have a very strong genetic and biological basis. Relatives of people with major depressive disorder have double the risk of developing major depressive disorder, whereas relatives of patients with bipolar disorder have over 9 times the risk of inheriting bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is extremely genetically linked, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. Twin studies consistently show that genetic factors play a very strong role in bipolar disorder when compared to other disorders. That being said, depression does have inherited and genetic characteristics, as well as certain neurotransmitters and regulation problems therein. People with mood disorders often have imbalances in certain neurotransmitters, particularly norepinephrine and serotonin. These neurotransmitters are important, and they regulate bodily functions that are highly disrupted by mood disorders, including appetite, sleep, arousal, and just basic drives. Medications that are used to treat major depressive disorder typically boost serotonin and norepinephrine activity. Now, depression is also linked to abnormal activity in several regions of the brain, including those important in assessing emotional information and like the emotional significance of stimuli or even experiencing emotions, and even in regulating and controlling those emotions. So experiencing emotions would be the amygdala, and regulating and controlling emotions would be the prefrontal cortex. Depressed individuals show elevated amygdala activity, especially when they're presented with negative emotional stimuli. Also, depressed individuals exhibit less activation in their prefrontal cortex, particularly on the left side. Because the prefrontal cortex can inhibit or dampen or lessen that amygdala activation, allowing somebody to suppress those negative emotions, the decreased activation in certain regions of the prefrontal cortex may inhibit a person's ability to override those negative emotions, which might then lead to more negative emotions. These findings suggest that depressed persons are more prone to react emotionally to negative stimuli, and at the same time have greater difficulty controlling those negative reactions. And as a side note, you guys, if your brain has that as part of its diversity of how it's functioning, then part of your responsibility is to be very careful with the things that are coming into the system. Perhaps watching a really sad or really violent movie is not the best choice during a time and season of depressive functioning. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about the cognitive or psychological factors involved in depression. Cognitive theories of depression take the view that depression is triggered by negative thoughts, interpretations, self-evaluations, and expectations. Longitudinal studies have supported this cognitive theory in showing that a pre-existing tendency to engage in a self-defeating, very negative style of thinking, when combined with life stress, over time predicts the onset of depression. Therefore, cognitive therapies that are aimed at changing the way a person thinks show a great amount of ability to alleviate some of these symptoms and change the course of the disorder. Another cognitive theory of depression is called learned helplessness or hopelessness theory. And that postulates that a particular negative style of thinking leads a person to a sense of hopelessness, which then leads to depression. A key assumption of this theory is that the hopelessness stems from a tendency to perceive negative life events as being stable, global, and internally caused. This means when a depressed person is trying to understand why something has happened, they're going to, number one, make an internal attribution and say that it's because of me. They're also going to make a stable attribution and say it's always going to be this way. And a global attribution that not only is it going to stay this way, but it's going to impact every area of my waking life and my future. So that's something to be mindful of. If you have a lot of automatic negative self-thoughts, that is not healthy. That is an attributional style or a style of thinking that's going to be kind of dangerous. And maybe you've gotten through okay right now in your young body and your young experiences, but you don't want to live in that space of automatically assuming the worst about yourself and others and life, right? So if you notice that you have automatic negative thoughts, you need to sort of stamp them out. And sometimes you need help from other people to recognize those thoughts, encounter those thoughts, challenge those thoughts, and reframe those thoughts. Also, if you have a pessimistic attributional style where you're constantly blaming yourself for things, you constantly see that there's no way out and it's going to be this way forever and it's going to be this way across situations, it's never going to change. Those are hallmarks of depressive thinking. So if some of those thoughts are pervasive and consistent, it really is time to acknowledge that that's not as healthy as it could be. And you have a great potential and a great worth. And your life is much bigger than just right here, right now. So taking steps to take care of yourself and reframe and re-understand the psychology of what's going on for you is really, really helpful and useful and important. Another cognitive theory of depression here is about rumination. Now, this cognitive theory of depression focuses on how people's thoughts about their distressed moods, depressed symptoms in particular, can increase the risk and duration of their depression. When you are ruminating, you are thinking about your thinking about your thinking. And if your thinking is negative, you're thinking about your negative thinking and then feeling bad about the negative thinking. I shouldn't be thinking this way. And then being hard on yourself about that. You're in a terrible loop and cycle of it getting worse, that negative thought. That negative thought brings up another negative thought. Now you've got two of them to think over, and they're going back and forth and back and forth. And you can see that rumination, it doesn't lead to good places. This theory focuses on rumination. So rumination is the repetitive and passive focus on the fact that one is depressed and dwelling on those depressed symptoms rather than distracting oneself from the symptoms or trying to address them in an active problem-solving manner. So when people ruminate, they have these thoughts like, why can't I just fix this problem? I'm never going to get my work done. It's not going to be okay. Why am I always like this? Other people, it's easier for other people. You know, it is a cycle and it just gets bigger that way. Now, women are more likely than men to ruminate when they're sad or depressed. And women are more likely to be diagnosed as having depression. And the tendency to ruminate is associated with increases in depressive symptoms, heightened risk of major depressive episodes, and more persistent episode displays. So what do we take away from this? Well, the three big things here for your information have to do with learned helplessness, pessimistic attribution, and rumination. If you are depressed or prone to depression, Having a psychological awareness of those three factors is going to bring a lot of wisdom into your life, especially when you couple it with professional and outside and safe care of people that can walk you towards focusing on what you can have an impact on, showing your agency and your ability to change things, changing your pessimistic attributional style to a more optimistic attributional style, as well as stopping this rumination process that is making the symptoms worse. Okay, so as we move forward in our survey of psychological disorders, we want to talk now about bipolar disorder. And there are two different bipolar disorders, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, and they indicate essentially severity in such a way as bipolar 1 has more severe extremes of mania, and bipolar 2 is more mild in its displays of mania. A person with bipolar disorder, and we used to call this manic depression, often experiences mood states that vacillate. They are mercurial. They go back and forth between depression and mania. That is, the person's mood is said to alternate from one extreme to the other extreme. To be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a person must have experienced a true manic episode. So just because someone's emotional or dramatic or is very up and down doesn't necessarily mean that they have bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is not as common as media representations might show it to be. To be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, you have to have true mania. And mania has some specific features that have to be met to make it a true bipolar case. So, to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a person must have experienced a manic episode, a true manic episode, at least once in their life. Although major depressive episodes are common for bipolar disorder, they're not required for a diagnosis. So the manic episode is the classifying feature. According to the DSM-5, a manic episode is characterized by a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, and abnormally and persistently increased activity or energy lasting at least 1 week that lasts most of the time each day. During a manic episode, some people experience a mood that's almost euphoric, and they might become increasingly talkative or spontaneously start conversations. Others might become extremely irritable or complain a lot and become hostile. A person might talk loudly and rapidly, exhibiting what we call a flight of ideas, abruptly switching from one topic to another. These individuals are easily distracted, which can make conversation quite difficult. They might even exhibit grandiosity, in which they experience inflated but unjustified self-esteem and self-confidence. They might take on several tasks at the same time. They might show very little, if any, need for sleep. People in a manic episode might also recklessly engage in pleasurable activities that could have harmful consequences. Spending sprees, reckless driving, investments, gambling, sexual encounters, creative activities, and other things that might make sense at the time and feel good at the time, but they're not thinking through the consequences. During a manic episode, individuals usually feel as though they're not ill and they don't need any help. However, the reckless behaviors that often go with these manic episodes may require hospitalization if they're not treated, if they're not balanced. Some people with bipolar disorder will experience something called rapid cycling, or the rapid cycling subtype. That's characterized by at least 4 manic episodes within 1 year, or some combination of 4 manic and 4 depressive, major depressive episodes back and forth within a year. Bipolar disorder is considerably less common than major depressive disorder, but it is strongly genetically inherited. And around half of those with bipolar disorder report an onset before the age of 25. Around 90% of those with bipolar disorder have a comorbid disorder, most often like an anxiety disorder or a substance abuse problem. Unfortunately, close to half of the people suffering from bipolar disorder do not receive treatment, and suicide rates are extremely high among those with bipolar disorder, especially those that are untreated. A 2010 study found that around 36% of individuals with the disorder attempted suicide at least once in their lifetime, and between 15 to 19% completed that suicide. Some brain studies have found that there is increased metabolic activity during cycles of mania and decreased metabolic activity in the brain during depression. Bipolar people often have high levels of norepinephrine and low levels of serotonin, as well as higher levels of glutamate. Can you think of a movie with a character with bipolar disorder? And what do you think? Did that movie romanticize mental health problems a little bit? What do you think? Okay, talking about another disorder that often has very romantic displays of media perceptions of it, we have the dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders are characterized by an individual becoming split off or dissociated from their core sense of self. Memory and identity become disturbed, and these disturbances have a psychological rather than physical cause. There are several dissociative disorders listed in the DSM, but we're just going to talk about two of them: dissociative amnesia and dissociative identity disorder. Amnesia refers to the partial or total forgetting of some experience or event. An individual with dissociative amnesia, therefore, is unable to recall important personal information, usually following an extremely stressful or traumatic experience. The memory impairments are not caused by ordinary forgetting. Some individuals with dissociative amnesia will also experience a dissociative fugue. This is the word sort of to flee in French, whereby they suddenly wander away from their home, experience confusion about their identity, and maybe even adopt a new identity. Most fugue episodes only last a few hours or days, but some can last longer. And in dissociative amnesia, you can sort of see how easy it is to have a disorder be comorbid or co-occurring with other disorders. If a person had been through a traumatic experience, it's possible that they could have post-traumatic stress or flights of amnesia or dissociative episodes, and maybe even substance abuse problems as well, right? So we have learned that trauma absolutely plays a role in many of these psychological disorders. Understanding trauma, responding appropriately to trauma, talking about trauma, having therapies that are trauma-informed is a very important piece of moving mental health forward in these years to come. And with all of my heart, I just want to say to you guys, if you've been through a traumatic experience and it is hard to process, please find people that are trained that can walk you through it. Please go to a professional that focuses on trauma and trauma therapy and that knows what they're doing there. It would be very, very, very useful to you, I promise. So you might ask yourself, well, what's dissociative amnesia? What's the brain doing? Well, in a lot of ways, it looks like the brain is trying to protect itself. It is taking in information that it just really can't handle, and it is shutting it out. Now, what do you think, you guys? What would the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic perspective think about dissociation? Now, by far, the most well-known dissociative disorder is dissociative identity disorder. You probably know this by the term multiple personality disorder. It is proposed that people with dissociative identity disorder exhibit two or more separate personalities or identities, each well-defined and distinct from one another. They also experience memory gaps for the time during which another identity is in charge, and in some cases may report hearing voices, such as a child's voice or the sound of someone crying. Dissociative identity disorder is highly controversial. Some practitioners don't believe that it actually exists, and some people think that those patients that are presenting with it might be either highly suggestible or performing in some way. And even those that believe that it's a valid disorder also believe that it might be overdiagnosed in such a way as the disorder can exist, but it's extremely, extremely rare. One reason that DID is controversial is because the rates of the disorder suddenly skyrocketed in the 1980s. More cases of DID were identified in the 5 years prior to 1986 than in the preceding 2 centuries. And a lot of that reason had to do with a couple films and books about DID. We had Faces of Eve and Sybil. So it's possible that there might be some social contagion involved. Possible. Despite its controversial nature, other practitioners do believe that it's a legitimate and serious disorder, and that it is quite rare but quite severe. People with this disorder tend to report a history of significant childhood trauma, often with severe sexual abuse as being part of the trauma. Research in the 1990s suggested that around 95% of people with DID were physically and or sexually abused as children. We do have strong evidence to suggest that traumatic experiences can cause people to experience states of dissociation, suggesting that dissociative states might serve as a coping mechanism for dealing with such threat, danger, and traumatic experiences. Something important to note here. Therapists play a very important role in the diagnosis and treatment of disorders. A good therapist is going to want a whole person. That means a person that is a well-integrated person. So a therapist that's doing therapy, 16 different therapies with 16 different multiple personalities, I don't think is doing their job. Their job as a therapist is to help a person integrate their past, present, and future, making sense of it in a whole sense so that they can move forward to optimal growth and good boundaries and success. So what I think is fair to say is something that we learn from DID is that trauma does have the capability to really split us and twist us and rip us apart. Trauma and our response and our coping mechanism to trauma can sometimes mean that we have to sort of shut off areas of our life so that we can just survive. And there's something beautiful about your body and mind's ability to get through really hard stuff. Dissociation, especially in traumatic experiences, is your psychology and your mind trying to protect you. But wholeness means that sometimes we've got to go back into that cave and make sense of those things. That you can't run forever, that you have to, with the safety of another person, take a flashlight and a sword and go into that area and at the pace that is appropriate, make sense of some of those places. Speaking of trying to make sense of different places, we want to switch now to schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia also is something that is displayed, I think, in a very unfair way on TV and in movies. Schizophrenics on TV are often shown as like aggressive and very violent. And I don't think that they're ever shown with the compassion that is due a very, very disturbing and awful and distressing condition. Because schizophrenia is a devastating psychological disorder. It's characterized by major disturbances in thought, perception, emotion, and behavior. About 1% of the population experiences schizophrenia in their lifetime. And usually the disorder is first diagnosed during early adulthood. That's usually early to mid-20s. Most people with schizophrenia experience significant difficulties in many day-to-day functioning activities, such as holding a job, paying bills, caring for themselves, and maintaining relationships with other people. Frequent hospitalizations are often more the rule rather than the exception. And even when they receive the best treatments available, many schizophrenics will continue to experience serious social and occupational impairments throughout their lifetime. Well, what is schizophrenia? Well, first off, schizophrenia is not dissociation. It's not a condition involving a split personality. It's not the same thing as dissociative identity disorder. Dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia are often confused because that word schizophrenia means split psyche. Schizophrenia is considered a psychotic disorder. It's one in which a person's thoughts, perceptions, and behaviors are impaired to the point where they're not able to function normally. In informal terms, one that suffers from a psychotic disorder is disconnected from the world in which most of us live. Not disconnected from themselves, but disconnected from reality. The main symptoms of schizophrenia include hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and disorganized or abnormal motor behavior. So you will see that a person with schizophrenia will have both positive symptoms. That doesn't mean that it's good symptoms. That means it is the addition of a symptom, something is being added, as well as negative symptoms, which means the taking away of something, taking away, in this case, for example, taking away emotion, which creates flat affect. So let's talk about some of these symptoms, starting with the positive symptoms. So a hallucination is a perceptual experience that occurs in the absence of any external sensory stimulation. Auditory hallucinations or hearing voices occur in roughly 2/3 of patients with schizophrenia, and by far the most common form of hallucination. The voices might be familiar or unfamiliar. They might have a conversation or argue with the person with schizophrenia, or the voices may provide a running commentary on the person's ongoing behavior. Visual and olfactory or vision and smell hallucinations are a little bit less common, as are the tactile or sensation, the skin crawling sensations. Delusions are beliefs that are contrary to reality and are firmly held even in the face of contradictory evidence. Oftentimes, a person with schizophrenia might have paranoid delusions, which involve the false belief that other people or agencies are plotting to harm them. They could also hold grandiose delusions or beliefs that they hold a special power, a unique knowledge, or that they are an extremely important superpower. Other delusions include the belief that one's thoughts are being removed. That's called thought withdrawal. Or thoughts have been placed inside of one's head. That's thought insertion. And another type of delusion is called somatic delusion, in which there is the belief that something highly abnormal is happening inside of one's body. For example, that their organs are twisting around, or that there's implantations of something inside of their body. Really scary, really troubling. And everything I'm talking about, I hope it sounds troubling to you, in the sense that in describing it, I think you can have some empathy that if this was you and this was your thought process, it would be very scary, it would be very uncomfortable, it would be very awful. Another type of positive symptom has to do with disordered thinking. So quite often, people with schizophrenia have disorganized or disordered thinking. And that refers to disjointed and incoherent thought processes. Usually that can be detected by what the person says. You'll often hear them ramble. They do something called word salad, which is just loose associations where they jump from topic to topic, and they're talking so quickly and so disorganized and incomprehensible that it seems like they're just randomly combining words. Disorganized thinking is also exhibited in illogical remarks, responding to other people's statements or questions in a way that's unrelated to what's been asked, and just essentially going off on tangents that are unrelated to the topic at hand. Another positive symptom or addition of a hardship is disorganized or abnormal motor behavior. And that refers to unusual behaviors and movements, usually becoming very active, physically active, exhibiting silly childlike behaviors like giggling and smiling and some strange nonverbal displays, engaging in repeated or maybe purposeless movements, or displaying odd facial expressions or odd nonverbal gestures. In some cases, the person will actually exhibit catatonic behaviors where they just sort of freeze in place and show a decreased reactivity to the environment. They could be rigid and in a bizarre posture for a long period of time, or have even a complete lack of movement. So there is a addition of disordered movement, and that makes it a positive symptom. Now, negative symptoms are those that reflect a noticeable decrease or absence in certain behaviors, emotions, or drives. A person that exhibits diminished emotional expression or shows no emotion in facial expressions, speech, or movements, even when those expressions would be normal or expected, that would be something called flat affect. Also, another negative symptom might be lack of motivation to engage in self-initiated or meaningful activity, stuff like bathing or grooming or going to work. Another way is to have a person withdraw from speaking, and that would be reduced speech output or withdrawal verbally. Another negative symptom is asociality or social withdrawal or lack of interest in engaging with people in social interaction. And a final negative symptom is the removal of joy or experiencing pleasure or joyful experiences. With those positive and negative symptoms, it's very easy to see how cognitively it would be very difficult to maintain attention and maintain memory, especially when you have often a very running dialogue of auditory hallucination interfering with your thought processes and your understanding of situations. Very much so, this can impair one's ability to interpret information, interpret the world correctly, and make sound, good decisions in the world. So what are some causes of schizophrenia? There's considerable evidence suggesting that schizophrenia has a genetic basis. The risk of developing schizophrenia is nearly 6 times greater if one has a parent with schizophrenia than if one doesn't. Additionally, one's risk of developing schizophrenia increases as genetic relatedness to a family member diagnosed with schizophrenia increases. So certainly it does look from family and twin studies like there is a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia. Not surprisingly, a number of neurobiological factors are indeed related to schizophrenia. One such factor that has received considerable attention in the many years that it's been studied is the neurotransmitter dopamine. So we get this interest in dopamine because we find 2 really interesting things. So drugs that increase dopamine levels can actually produce schizophrenic symptoms or schizophrenia-like symptoms in people. And also, medications that block dopamine activity can reduce those symptoms. So this is something called the dopamine hypothesis. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia proposed that an overabundance of dopamine or too many dopamine receptors are responsible for the onset and maintenance of schizophrenia. So the work in this area suggests that abnormalities in dopamine vary by brain region and can contribute to symptoms in unique ways. So in general, this research is suggesting that an overabundance of dopamine in the limbic system is responsible for some of the symptoms like hallucinations and delusions, where low levels of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex might be responsible for some of those negative symptoms, In recent years, serotonin and glutamate have received some research attention as well. And newer antipsychotic medications often are working on serotonin and glutamate receptors, so those two neurotransmitters might be implicated as well. Brain imaging studies reveal that people with schizophrenia have enlarged ventricles. Those are the cavities within the brain that contain the cerebral spinal fluid. This finding is important because larger than normal ventricles suggest that various brain regions are smaller in size, thus implying that schizophrenia is associated with some deterioration or loss of brain tissue. In addition, many people with schizophrenia will display a reduction of gray matter, those are the cell bodies of the neurons, in their frontal lobes. And they might show less frontal lobe activity when performing cognitive tasks. The frontal lobes are so important, as you remember, for executive function that has to do with attention and intention, thought processes, focusing, planning, regulating. So abnormalities in that region help us explain why people with schizophrenia experience deficits in those domains of life and thinking and planning. Now, we also see that there is absolutely a diathesis stress connection or vulnerability stress connection. So let's walk this back a little bit when we're talking about sort of biopsychosocial when it comes to schizophrenia. So a study in 2004 found that adoptees whose mothers had schizophrenia, so therefore they had a high genetic risk of schizophrenia, those adoptees that also were raised in a disturbed family environment, they were much more likely to develop schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder. And that's even compared to adoptees whose mothers did have schizophrenia, so there was a high genetic risk, but they were raised in a healthy environment. And that's also compared to adoptees that had a very low genetic risk that were raised in a disturbed environment. Because the adoptees who were at a high genetic risk were likely to develop schizophrenia only if they were also raised in a disturbed environment, that study supports this vulnerability stress interpretation of schizophrenia, because both genetic vulnerability and environmental stress are necessary for schizophrenia to develop, that the genes alone do not account for the complete picture or the display of the disorder. Okay, so let's move on to personality disorders. Now, it's important to remember that personality disorders are not just normal fluctuations in adult personality. People with personality disorders exhibit a personality style that differs markedly from the expectations of their culture. It's pervasive and inflexible. It begins in early adolescence or adulthood, and that personality disorder causes distress or impairment to a normal, healthy, well-functioning life. Generally, individuals with these disorders exhibit enduring personality styles that are extremely troubling and often create problems for them and the people with whom they come in contact. Their maladaptive personality styles frequently bring them into conflict with others, and it disrupts their ability to develop and maintain healthy social relationships, as well as often it prevents them from accomplishing realistic life goals. The DSM-5 recognizes 10 personality disorders, and they're organized into 3 different clusters. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we are going to talk about 2 of the most popularized, and that has to do with antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. So a person with antisocial personality disorder, this is in cluster B, continually violates the rights of others, has a history of antisocial tendencies prior to age 15, often lies, fights, and has problems with the law, is impulsive and fails to think ahead, can often be deceitful and manipulative in order to gain profit or pleasure or just really their own goals, is often irresponsible, and can fail to hold down a job or maybe pay their debts, and often lacks feelings for other people and lacks a remorse over their misdeeds. According to the DSM-5, an individual with antisocial personality disorder shows no regard at all for other people's rights or feelings. This lack of regard is exhibited a number of ways and can include repeatedly performing illegal acts, lying or conning others or manipulating others, impulsivity and recklessness, irritability and aggressiveness, and failure to act in moral or responsible ways. The worst part about antisocial personality disorder, however, is that people with this disorder have no remorse over their dealings with people or their misdeeds or their mistreatments. These people can hurt, manipulate, exploit, and abuse others and not feel any guilt. People with antisocial personality disorder seem to view the world as self-serving and unkind. They seem to think that they should be able to use whatever means necessary to get by in life. They tend to view other people as not really living and thinking and feeling beings, but rather as pawns or tools to be used for their purposes. They often have an overinflated sense of themselves and can often appear confident or at least somewhat arrogant. They frequently display superficial charm. They can have, what's scary about it is they can have quite good, charming social skills. They see it as a tool to be able to manipulate and get what they want from life. They very clearly lack empathy, and they're incapable of understanding the emotional point of view of other people. They can't take the perspective of another person and feel what that person is feeling. A useful way to kind of think of antisocial personality disorder is remembering that it has these three major concepts: disinhibition, boldness, and cruelty. So disinhibition has to do with the propensity towards impulse control problems, lack of planning, lack of forethought, insistence on immediate gratification, and inability to restrain their own behavior or kind of think through the consequences of their behavior. That boldness or confidence describes a tendency to remain very calm in threatening situations. So they have high self-assurance, a sense of tremendous pervasive dominance, and a tendency towards thrill-seeking because they just really don't feel a lot in general. So they need quite the thrill to be able to feel anything at all. And also cruelty or meanness is just defined as an aggressive resource-seeking without regard for other people. And that's signaled by lack of empathy, lack of compassion, contempt or disdain for other people, a disdain for close or intimate relationships, and a tendency and an okayness they feel fine with accomplishing their goals through cruelty or the suffering of other people. One estimate from the early 2000s had antisocial personality disorder observed in about 3.5% of the population, and that disorder was more common among males. It's about a 3-to-1 ratio of men to women. It's more likely to occur in men who are younger, widowed, separated, divorced, of lower socioeconomic status, or who live in urban areas, and who live in the Western United States. Compared to men with antisocial personality disorder, women with the disorder are more likely to have experienced emotional neglect and sexual abuse during childhood, and they are more likely to have had parents who abused substances or who engaged in antisocial behaviors themselves. Family, twin, and adoption studies suggest that both genetic and environmental factors influence the development of antisocial personality disorder, as well as general antisocial behavior like criminality, violence, or aggressiveness. Some personality and temperament dimensions that are related to this disorder include fearlessness, impulsiveness, and callousness. And those personality characteristics tend to have genetic influence. As we saw, those with antisocial tendencies do not seem to experience emotions the way other people do. These individuals fail to show fear in response to the environmental cues that signal punishment, pain, or bad stimulation. For example, they show less physiological reactance in anticipation of electric shock than do people without antisocial personality disorder. So there is some research to suggest that people with antisocial personality disorder have sympathetic and autonomic nervous system functioning that's different from normal. That normal fight or flight that you have when a cop car is behind you and the lights come up and you're like, oh no, I'm going to get in trouble, or I'm speeding, oh no, like that thought and that rush. They don't feel that. Their sympathetic nervous system doesn't do the same thing that yours does under stressful situations. And that lack of nervous system responding, along with lack of empathy, can be very, very scary. So we do have evidence to show that there might be genetic and brain and autonomic nervous system differences for antisocial individuals. And what's a little thought here in regard to empathy or evil or the big picture? The big picture here is that people without empathy have really no brake pedal for when it comes to interacting with other people. So you need to be careful with your close relationships when you are in close relationship or in business or in a family or in a setting that's very intimate and close. Empathy is a really, really important component of a safe, healthy relationship. Now, oftentimes people with antisocial personality disorders become actually quite skilled and quite socially charming because it's just another tool to be able to get things from people in a way that they need, to get what they need. So please be careful in your life, my college students, my loves. Please be careful with the people that you give your heart and your money or your time or your talent or your secrets or your life to, right? Just because someone is socially skilled, be on the lookout for social skill plus empathy. That's going to be a much safer relationship. If empathy is missing, even if confidence and swagger and charisma are very high, if empathy is missing, something in your system should say, hey, I need to have a healthy boundary here. People with antisocial personality disorder can be very, very harmful. And it's unlikely, just so you know, it's unlikely for them to be able to have a true relationship with you. So if you're in a relationship with someone that has some of these tendencies, it's time to get out. You're not going to win him over. You're not going to win her over. Your healthiness and love is not going to heal those places. It's time to set the boundary and do what is healthy for everyone. Okay, we want to talk about another personality disorder. And the reason that we're talking about these two is I think these two personality disorders are the ones that you need to be very, very careful around. You need to really sort of be like, hey, a healthy boundary with people that display these things. So let's talk about borderline personality disorder. So what are some symptoms of borderline personality disorder? Frantic efforts to avoid real or even imagined abandonment or rejection. Having a pattern of unstable relationships, or often characterizing these relationships by either romanticizing them or putting them in like an ideal category, or devaluing a person entirely. This is called like either or black and white thinking. It's also called splitting. and people with borderline personality disorder do a lot of this type of thinking. They might struggle with unstable self-image or identity. They might engage in risky or impulsive behavior. People with borderline personality disorder could have frequent suicidal thoughts or engage in self-harming behavior. They might experience periods of emotional intensity and frequent or rapid dramatic mood swings. Very dramatic. And those dramatic mood swings actually convey that on the inside they have a deep sense of emptiness and lack of purpose. They often have an intense or uncontrollable anger or rage underneath the surface. There's a lot of resentment and contempt and anger. And sometimes they can even dissociate or have like out-of-body experiences where they're not kind of inside of their own feelings. The borderline in borderline personality disorder is originally coined in the 1930s, and it's an effort to describe patients that appeared anxious, but were also prone to brief psychotic breaks or episodes. That is, patients that were thought to be literally on the borderline between anxiety and psychosis. Today, borderline personality disorder has a completely different meaning. So borderline personality disorder is characterized chiefly and mainly by instability in interpersonal relationships, instability in self-image and mood, as well as marked impulsivity and potential for self-harm. People with borderline personality disorder cannot tolerate the thought of being alone, and they make frantic efforts, including like suicidal gestures or self-mutilation or dramatic attempts and displays for attention, to avoid abandonment or rejection or separation. Their relationships are really intense, but very unstable. And these individuals have a very unstable view of themselves as well. And they might display rapid shifts in personal attitudes, interests, career plans, and choices of friends and relationships. People with borderline personality disorder are also quite impulsive and can engage in reckless and self-destructive behaviors. Stuff like gambling, spending money or going on a spending spree, substance abuse, drug use, unsafe sex, reckless driving. Sometimes they can show intense and inappropriate resentment and anger, and they can have a hard time controlling that contempt or resentment or anger. They can also be moody and sarcastic and bitter and verbally abusive. Borderline personality disorder is comorbid with anxiety, mood, and substance use disorders. Now, people with this disorder can also be at times quite charming or seductive or amazing or very romantic. They can definitely put on the charm. But what's crazy about an interaction with them is that they're so hot and so cold and so dramatic and so either or. It's like being absorbed in a teen melodrama, right? Where things are very, very exaggerated, very dramatic. Now, if you know people that are really unstable and really, really hot and cold and really emotional and are constantly changing and constantly up and down and constantly threatening to hurt themselves and constantly sort of using other people to support their self-image, if that describes one of your friends, for example, I want to strongly encourage you that you cannot be a friend and a therapist to them at the same time. One of the main ways that people get better with their mental health struggles is with good boundaries and often with outside help. So you can't be the therapist and the best friend at the same time. That's a dual relationship. That's two relationships at the same time. That's a bad boundary. So if you have a friend that's displaying a lot of these symptoms, the best thing that you can do for them is encourage them towards healthy relationships with outside professional and trained others, because you can be a friend, But you can't be a friend and a psychiatrist at the same time. And you can't be a friend and a psychotherapist at the same time. And if in any of your relationships you are wearing too many hats at the same time, too many roles, that's not healthy for your mental health either. So what are some causes of borderline personality disorder? Well, genetic factors appear to be important, again, in the development of borderline personality disorder. Core personality traits that characterize this disorder, such as impulsivity, emotional instability, those personality traits show a high degree of heritability. Also, the rates of borderline personality disorder among relatives of people with the disorder have been as high as 24 to 25%. Individuals with borderline personality disorder report experiencing childhood physical, sexual, or emotional abuse at rates far greater than those observed in the general population, indicating also that environmental factors are crucial. These findings would suggest that borderline personality disorder may be determined by an interaction between genes and environment. This is vulnerability stress. Consistent with this hypothesis, one study found the highest rates of borderline personality disorder were among individuals with a borderline temperament who also experienced childhood abuse or neglect. There are also some cognitive reasons that cluster with this borderline personality disorder, including an irrational belief that one is powerless, unacceptable, or that others are constantly out to get them. So can you treat antisocial personality disorder or can you treat borderline personality disorder? Well, they're both really hard to treat in general. Well, it's going to be quite difficult to treat either one. Your book talks about some treatments for borderline personality disorder. In my clinical perspective, however, it is extremely difficult to treat. And that's often because these personality traits are so far entrenched into a person's displays and relationships and cognitive patterns that getting in there and getting a truthful conversation with healthy boundaries is really difficult. So the reason to be careful and take care is that we see that there's some really big implications for psychological disorders. And one of those outcomes, negative outcomes, is suicide. The prevalence of suicide has skyrocketed in recent years. It is the 10th leading cause of death, and it is the second leading cause of death for American adolescents between the ages of 10 and 34. That's children all the way through to early adults, right? Children through adults, second leading cause of death. Many people that complete suicide have had a mental disorder. And the sad thing about that is many of those mental disorders, the most common two would be mood disorders and substance abuse disorders. Those two disorders have treatments that are actually quite effective and that could improve the quality of life considerably if people were to receive treatment. There's an increase in suicide in rural areas as well as mountain states and in the Midwest. White men or Caucasian men are particularly vulnerable, especially adult men 45 to 64 years old. But that gender gap of men to women is closing over the years as more and more women complete suicides. Oftentimes, more women will attempt suicides and more men will actually complete them. The reason for that is that women often will use maybe poison or pills, whereas males will often use firearms as a way to end their life. Some particularly vulnerable populations are LGBTQ people, as well as new moms, postpartum moms, and adolescents. But the scale of the problem is so significant as we see across-the-board increases across socioeconomic status, ethnicity, race, and location. Suicidal risk is especially high among people with substance abuse problems. And the risk of suicidal behavior is especially high among those that have made a previous attempt. Suicidal individuals are at high risk for terminating their life if they have lethal means in which to do it, such as a firearm nearby or a firearm in the home. Withdrawal from social relationships, feeling as though one is a burden to others, and engaging in reckless or risk-taking behaviors may be precursors to suicidal behavior. A sense of entrapment or feeling unable to escape one's miserable feelings or external circumstances can predict suicidal behavior. Suicides can have a contagious effect on people. This is something called the copycat effect or the Werther effect. For example, another suicide, especially that of a family member, heightens one's own risk of suicide. Additionally, widely publicized suicides tend to trigger copycat suicides in some very similar individuals. A review of 42 studies concluded that media coverage of celebrity suicides is more than 14 times more likely to trigger copycat suicides than is the coverage of non-celebrity suicides. Suicidal thoughts, plans, or even offhanded remarks should always be taken seriously. People who contemplate terminating their life need immediate help. And for people that struggle with suicidal ideation, have loved ones that might be suicidal, or have lost loved ones to suicide, it's really important to protect those people by having direct conversations with them about their mental health and what they're going through. So I've put the National Suicide Prevention Hotline here for you. 1-800-273-8255. If you or someone you know is experiencing some of these thoughts and feelings and experiences, it's really important to directly address them right now. Hey man, are you thinking of hurting yourself? Or hey man, I just heard you say that. Are you serious? Do you mean that? Hey man, what did that comment mean online? Hey best friend, I saw that you post something kind of, what did that mean? Can you describe that to me? Hey, do you need some help? Hey, address things directly. When you address things directly, what you're saying to that person is, I see you. I value you. Your life matters. And so I want to say this to you at the end of the semester. I see you. You are valuable. Your life matters. And one more thing to add to the mix here. It gets better, guys. How things are today, they don't stay that way. Light and momentary are these afflictions, and they will pass. So if you need help today, it's time to do the smart thing, do the brave thing, and reach out for help. And I want so much more for you too. I have no words to describe how much I desire for you guys to know how special you are. That your unique life and your talents and the things that you're meant to do are meant for you, uniquely for you. You're here for a good purpose. I am so proud to have been your teacher during this semester. It fills me with intense love and tenderness and pride to know that I had the honor of teaching you guys during this semester. So congratulations, a huge congratulations to you. You are at the tail end. You're almost there. So proud of you. So proud. I really hope you've learned something in this class that you carry with you, because I know I'm going to carry you with me after we're done. So thank you, class. Thank you so much for your time and talent and tenderness this semester. And congratulations, you did it.